All right, buyer walks into the house for their final walkthrough and everything looks great. It's freshly cleaned, carpets cleaned, move-in ready, and then somebody notices something. Where's the refrigerator? Wait, they say, where did the fridge go? Well, we make a call to the listing agent. We find out, the movers that loaded it onto the truck and it's headed to the East Coast. Then we pull up the contract just to make sure that the appropriate box was checked. And suddenly everyone is staring at a clause they thought they understood. The included items clause in the purchase and sale agreement, because what looks obvious inside a house is not always obvious inside the contract. And that one little misunderstanding can suddenly turn into a real dispute. So today we are unpacking one of the most overlooked sections in the entire purchase and sale agreement, line 5 on page 1 and paragraph C on page 2. And if you're a buyer, seller, or a real estate agent, this is something you absolutely need to understand. Well, welcome to Deep Dive on the Deal. This show is where we take real live real estate situations that happen during transactions and unpack the contract language hiding underneath them. Because most problems in real estate don't come from bad intentions, they come from misunderstood paperwork. And today, we're going to talk about a clause that almost everyone really skims past. It's the included items section of the purchase and sale agreement. Joining me today is someone who I just adore and love, but he's also seen many of these issues play out more times than most people in this business. That's David Bastian. David is both our designated broker and a real estate attorney, which gives him a very unique perspective on how these contracts actually work in the real world. Dave, welcome back to the show.
James, I can't think of anything I'd rather be doing right now.
I love you. Everybody's got to see Dave.
Here we go.
Here we go. So hey, let's start with the actual contract language. When someone opens the purchase and sale agreement on page 1, there's a section called included items, line 5, and this is where people see a list of checkboxes. Things like stoves, refrigerators, washer and dryers, dishwashers, microwaves, fireplace inserts, hot tubs, attached speakers, cameras, attached televisions, even generators. These items are included if the corresponding box is checked, and well, Form 21 residential purchase and sale agreement, often that's the story here. So what's important about this list?
Well, I often tell brokers if you want it, you need to ask for it. And that's a really important concept as you're drafting a contract. You need to be interviewing your client after they've gone through the home and talking to them about what here do you want to have as part of this purchase. Because if you don't ask for it, things can get a little fuzzy and a little gray sometimes, and the way you clear that up is by asking for things in writing. One of the issues that we see happening with this line 5, and you'll notice by reading it that after each one of those appliances that you named, there's S's in parens after every single one of them, which means we're talking about plurals. So if there's more than one refrigerator, we're talking about all the refrigerators. If there's more than one washer or dryer, we're talking about all the washers and dryers, all of the microwaves, all of those things. And I think that gets overlooked sometimes. One of the situations that happens frequently is a person might have a refrigerator in the kitchen, and then they also have one out in their garage as a spare. And sellers often don't recognize that they've sold the refrigerator out in the garage. And so when the transaction is closing and the seller's moving out, they often take that additional refrigerator with them. And then when the buyer comes in, either the deal's closed and they're coming back to the home for the first time, or they're doing their final walkthrough, which is an opportunity to make sure that all of the systems and things are still in place, and they find that it's not there, and now it's news to the seller that they sold the other refrigerator. And so as listing brokers, it's really important for us to make sure that the sellers know what they're selling, and as buyer brokers, it's really important that we put on in the paperwork what the buyers are buying. And it isn't good enough that the listing agreement or the published listing says, two refrigerators are being sold with the home, because the listing is nothing more than an offer to a buyer, or it's a invitation to the buyer to make an offer on the property. And that's where the contract starts happening, is when the offer is made. So if you don't ask for it, you don't get it. And if you don't, as a seller, if you don't exclude it, you might have sold it. And so on both sides of the transaction, the brokers need to be doing their jobs. Buyers need to be including what the buyers want to buy, and the sellers need to exclude what they don't intend to sell. What I tell our brokers is that if it's at all possible to remove something from the home, if the seller doesn't want to sell it, get it out of there, because it will, then you can avoid the disappointment. When you leave something in there and you say, yeah, but we're not selling that, you just built in an issue that you're going to have to negotiate.
Right.
If you eliminate it right up front, it'll never become an issue. So it's a good idea, if you can, if a seller doesn't want to sell something, just remove it from the home. If that's not practical, in some cases it's not. Like say I had a 140-inch giant expensive TV and I was going to take it with me. Yeah. If I remove that in the first place, I'd probably be leaving an ugly looking bracket or some holes in the wall, and that's not going to help the presentation. So when we're talking about things that are really impractical, then it's very important to manage the buyer's expectations so that they don't come in looking at the home and thinking, oh, wow, I want to buy that. And that becomes part of their desire to own the home. So if you can't remove it, then you want to manage those expectations and very clearly state right up front, so they don't get their heart set on that thing. Just tag it somehow. Right. Put a ribbon on it, put a sticky on it, something that says that this particular item's not going to sell with the home.
Man, this takes me back early in my career, 2003. I think you were the managing broker for me back then, but I had done a deal and I forgot to check the hot tub box. And we didn't make a big deal about it, and thankfully they left it, but I was sweating bullets until closing and possession. And from that point on, I went through a little period where I'd write under all items advertised per listing, just in case you missed something. That kind of was like a fail safe.
Well, and that was a practice back in those days.
Yep.
One of the things that a lot of managing brokers taught their agents was to print out the agent detail from the listing. Yep. And include it as part of the contract. So then it comes in along with all the addenda to the purchase and sale agreement, and the seller and the buyer's initial on it. I don't think that's a great practice, especially for a seller, because now you've taken items that are representations maybe of the seller, but the buyer has to do their due diligence to verify whether or not something is true. Like, for example, let's say square footage of a home, and you have, for example, 2,000 square feet listed as your square footage on the home. Well, that's a representation that the seller's made, but it's a representation that the buyer should verify themselves if that's important to them. If a couple of square feet here or there makes a difference to them, then they should be the ones that are investigating that and not relying on what the seller is saying, the 2,000 square feet. But if you put the agent detail sheet and everybody initials it, and now becomes contractual. Now, instead of it being the seller saying, hey, I think my home's around 2,000 square feet, but you check that out if that's really important to you, to now it's like, hey, if it's not 2,000 square feet, that's a breach of contract. Now the seller is in breach of contract. And so, especially for sellers, I think it's a really bad idea to incorporate that into your contract. It's less of a problem for buyers.
Yep.
But if I'm a seller and I see that coming in, it's a hard no.
It's a hard no. Yep.
I'm not doing that.
I remember that because that was a thing for a while way back then.
Yeah.
Huh. Well, hey, let's turn the page. Let's talk about paragraph C, which is just in the general terms, page 2. So paragraph C dramatically expands what might actually transfer with the home. Let's talk about that.
Okay, well, paragraph C basically says things that are going to transfer from the seller to the buyer include all of the items in item number 5 if the box is checked, and that's what we were just talking about. And then it adds in a number of different things. It's a pretty long list, but it talks about built-in appliances, wall-to-wall carpeting. One of the things that comes up fairly frequently is curtains, drapes, and other window treatments. That's another item that buyers move in and those things are gone, and sellers often don't understand that they sold their curtains, drapes, and other window treatments. That's part of the purchase price and you can't leave with them. And when that happens, as a buyer, you just have to point out to the seller, look, you sold that to me, it's part of the contract, and then they have to come back or the seller needs to pay for them. If the seller refused to do that, the buyer's legal remedy would be to go replace them. What I would tell a buyer to do is replace them. If the seller's not going to play ball, the buyer goes and replaces them. I would send the invoice to the seller and say, you know, the contract says they were supposed to stay, they didn't, I replaced them, please reimburse me. And then if they decided not to do that, then the legal remedy would be to go to small claims court and say that there's a breach of contract and here are my damages.
Well, let's just pick up off that. What leverage does a buyer broker have when a seller breaches that clause, but you got a closing date that's tomorrow?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. And one of the things that happens in this industry, which actually makes me very nervous, is that you might have a buyer broker. Let's say you come in and a window treatment's gone. Mm-hmm. You know, how much would you say it would cost to fix that problem? How much money would you have to spend to replace it?
Well, it depends. Are they Versace drapes or are they from Walmart?
Let's just say that they're standard for Port Orchard.
Does Versace even make drapes, Dave?
I don't know.
That just...
I don't even know who that is, but it sounds Italian.
Let's stick with Levi's.
Okay, right. So let's just pretend I'm making up this number. Let's say that it's $200 to fix that problem.
Right.
Okay, so not all breaches of contract are equal. You essentially have two different kinds of breach of contract. You have a material breach of contract, that's the significant one. And a material breach of contract allows the other party, the non-breaching party, to discontinue performance on the contract. So in other words, if you and I were under contract and I committed a material breach of the contract, you could say, Dave, I'm out of this contract. It's over, I'm walking away from it. Mm-hmm. So contrast that with substantial performance. And so in the context of a home sale, the fact that a seller walked away wrongfully with the drapes or the window treatments, would you think that that's material, or would you think that the seller substantially performed?
It's not material.
It's not material, okay? So we have substantial performance. Well, you remember in the first example, where you have a material breach, you can walk away from that. The non-breaching parties relieved from performance under those circumstances. But when you have substantial performance, the courts like to deal with that with money damages. So people go through with the contract, but then it's like, okay, how does the breaching party make the other party whole under these circumstances? And it would be to pay them the cost of the replacement of the window treatment, or to go get it and have it installed, or something along those lines. But it's not walking away from the contract. So when you have a broker who is advising their client, the buyer, you don't have to close this transaction over a window treatment, and then they don't close the transaction, guess who's committed a material breach now?
There you go.
So that is really serious. And you know, if we were to advise our client to do that and they followed our advice, we could have some.
It would be a malpractice.
Yeah, it would be a malpractice on the part of that broker. And so, you know, all of these situations are fact-based and not legal-based. So whether or not something is material or there's substantial performance is a factual issue. So as a lawyer, the only way I could tell you the distinction between the two is if I could go find case law that actually addresses that situation and see how the court held under those circumstances. So when you're getting into, I mean, there's stuff that's easy. You know, like for example, if the seller failed to install siding on the home and they were required to by the contract to do that, and that's probably pretty safe guess to say that that's a material breach of the contract. The example we gave, so we got one end of the spectrum, way, and then we got the other, which is no way, and that is the failure to, you know, to walking off with the drapes. But there's a lot of stuff in between there.
All that gray matter.
It's a lot of gray stuff, and that's all factual. You don't know the answer to that until you're before a judge or a jury that's deciding.
And that's a risky proposition.
It is, and it's expensive, and usually these kinds of problems don't warrant litigation.
Right.
You know, so that's what makes them particularly difficult to decide, because if you're not going to threaten the litigation, sometimes you don't have any leverage in that negotiation. But here's how you fix it. And as you have brokers that know how to write the contract, and if you represent a buyer and the buyer wants it, you put it in the contract. And if you're a seller and the seller wants to keep it, you exclude it from the contract. And you can fix all of the problems by just being in tune with your client, knowing what they want, what they need, asking them, having them give you direction. So we always need to remember it's our clients that are running the show. We're just agents. We do what our clients tell us to do. And so we shouldn't be making those decisions for them. They should be directing us on what we should be putting into the contract.
Hey, well, let's take it back to paragraph C in fixtures. Let's talk about fixtures.
Oh, well.
Opening up a can of worms?
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
That's good.
So the ultimate, you know, in this industry, we have a lot of sayings, and some of them about fixtures, and that is if it's screwed in, it's a fixture. And that might be true in some cases, but it's not true in all cases, and probably in most cases. In fact, if I don't want something to be permanently affixed, I put it in with a screw, because the screw is easy to back out. And so the fact that it's screwed in might be evidence that it's not a fixture. But we have a lot of people that believe if it's screwed in, then it's a fixture. The ultimate in determining whether or not something's a fixture is the intent of the affixor. Sometimes you can get that information easily, but a lot of times what you're doing is you're looking at evidence of what the intent of the affixor was. And so now you're looking at things like, well, how much damage is going to be left when it's removed? How much damage is going to be left behind? Or how much damage is there going to be to the thing that's getting removed? You know, are you going to kind of destroy it? Or do you have to completely disassemble it? Like last week there was an example of a gazebo in the backyard, and it was a huge gazebo and it was heavy. And in this case, it had to be completely dismantled. You know, when you start getting a fact pattern like that, you know, and you're just thinking about it from a reasonable person standpoint, it's like, wow, that sure seems like the intent was for it to stay, not, you know, that was a permanent thing that now becomes part of the real estate as opposed to something that the seller can walk away with. And that happens in residential real estate deals, like a gazebo being gone when the buyer moves in. You know, if it was a really light metal gazebo that a couple people could just, you know, pull screws out of the deck and lift it up and walk away with it, you know, maybe that's not a fixture. But again, Those are factual questions, not legal questions, and sometimes it's really hard to determine whether something is a fixture or not a fixture. But there's one really easy way to fix it, and that is when the parties agree. So when the parties agree as to whether or not that, you don't have to say that the gazebo is a fixture, you just say that the gazebo stays. But sometimes that's easier said than done because it's very difficult for a real estate broker to go through and anticipate everything and put everything in the contract. That's a really high standard.
It's true, especially after you've maybe shown 10 houses and then they go back to house number 2 and you don't quite have a recollection, or maybe you didn't take notes at the time because you didn't know which house was jumping off the page to them. So it can be problematic.
Well, that's one reason why if I'm looking at a lot of different properties, I take pictures because those are my notes. Because I will not remember from one house to the next which one's where, but if I take pictures and then just put them together in groups, then that can help remind me, especially when I'm seeing something like, we better ask for that.
Right.
You know, then I'm gonna take a picture of it and then I'm gonna talk to my client and say, do you want this included? And usually the answer is yes, you know, and so we'll include it and then it becomes negotiable. Maybe the seller wants to take it, but we get it negotiated and resolved by the time we're under contract. We had an experience once a number of years ago where we had a home.
I know what you're talking about.
Do you?
Yes.
You also know the broker.
Yes.
That was involved. And this home, which was our listing, had a beautiful sun room in the back. And you'd go in the sun room, it was really nicely set up so you could sit down and enjoy the scenery, because outside of the sunroom was the most beautiful backyard you've ever seen, with exotic trees, a water feature. It was just incredible. It was the feature of the home. Everybody that came through saw that and just oohed and awed over it. Well, when this transaction closed and the buyer moved in, and they were very excited to go in and enjoy their beautiful sunroom and all the scenery, the backyard was empty.
Ooh.
There were no trees, there were no plants, there was nothing going on back there.
But a lot of stress.
But a lot of stress and
disappointment.
A lot of disappointment. That's really disappointing for a buyer broker, because they want to have this thing just be a wonderful experience for their buyer, and then the last thing that happens, they get there and they're just completely disappointed. You know, so that can become a problem. Well, it did become a problem, and it came to me, and so what do is we look at the contract, and you look at included items under paragraph C, and you start looking down all of the items that are supposed to be, by agreement, fixtures. And as you read it, one of the lines down here says, shrubs, plants, and trees planted in the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So that does not include potted plants. Well, as it turned out, the owner of this property was a landscape designer, and the backyard was all his inventory. And all of those shrubs, trees, and plants were in pots, which happened to be in the ground, and there was mulch over the top of it. Ooh. In order to preserve the...
I forgot about that part.
So, you know, literally, if anybody went out there to even verify this, it would be very difficult for them to verify it. But the reality is that based on this language, those were shrubs, plants, and trees not planted in the ground. And so, based on the definition of this language, even though it would have been really difficult to discover by anybody, you know, some people say, well, yeah, but the plants were planted in the ground because the pots they were in were planted in the ground. And it's like, okay, make that argument and go spend a whole bunch of money litigating that and roll the dice and see how that turns out for you. You know, so when we talk about this is one of those scary war stories that we talk about, and the brokers look at me with pale faces and say, what do we do? And it's like, well, okay, that's happened one time in 30 years, so I don't think it's really high on the risk list, but the takeaway from that is there's no way that you're going to catch everything. We do the best we can, we talk to our clients, we get information from them, they tell us what they want, and we get it into the contract. But it's never going to be perfect. In this case, the seller was our client, and we went back and said, hey, the buyers got there, and we're very excited to go sit in their sunroom, and it was not as they expected. And that's when he explained, oh yeah, well, I'm a landscape designer and that was my inventory. And it's like, well, you've got some pretty unhappy buyers. And good for him, he came back and I don't know if he brought back his exact inventory, but he made that backyard gorgeous and he took care of these buyers. And so it was...
That's just good faith. That's nice.
It was nice. He did the right thing. That was the moral thing, even though potentially we had a contract argument that he didn't need to do that.
Right.
But I'm very glad, just from a personal standpoint of it being very important that we do the right thing, and sometimes the contractual thing isn't necessarily the right thing. He did the right thing and everybody was happy in the end, and I'm grateful for that outcome.
So on the flip side, what you're saying is, sellers out there, if you have that Japanese maple that's a sentimental gift from grandma who passed away 10 years ago and you're going to sell the house, mark it as an excluded item, right?
Yep, exactly.
So Dave,
yeah.
Let's talk about the chandelier story. You've shared that with me in your before, and I think these are great learning moments.
Yeah. Okay. So this is involving me personally. So it was a home. It was back when the market was really bad, like 2009, and we were actually out of town. We were in a town where we have children and grandchildren, and we were considering just at least kicking the tires on a home that was really close to where our grandkids were. And when we went through this home, every single room had a really unique, eclectic chandelier in there. And as we went through, it was kind of exciting to go to the next room and see what the owner had done with that room. To just these incredible, colorful chandeliers. Every one was a little different. Many of them were antiques and some were modern. Like I say, it was really eclectic. Well, I really liked that, thought that would be fun. And so I'm kind of thinking, boy, this is a really good purchase price, and maybe we ought to do this. And I'm now going to the stage that buyers often do of talking themselves into justifying the purchase price. Mm-hmm. And so I'm right at that stage, which is right at the place before you say, let's do it. So I'm right there. And I mentioned something about just the wonderful chandeliers to the listing broker who was taking us through. And the listing broker, as she's leaving the house, just over her shoulder said, oh yeah, the chandeliers don't stay. And I was like, what? I mean, you could have led with that, right?
Right.
That might be the first thing you want to say. I understand how you don't want to take all the chandeliers out of the house and replace all the lighting, but you ought to, especially when it's such a central feature of the home, you probably better say that up front, because what ended up happening was I was so upset by the fact that those chandeliers aren't going to stay that just took me all the way out of wanting to buy the house. It's like, forget it then. If they don't stay, I'm out. Whereas if I'd known up front that those weren't part of the deal, it was still a really good deal without the chandeliers. I might have moved forward with it. So the fact that my expectations were not managed properly ended those negotiations before they even began. And so as brokers, we need to just be aware of that and be wise and understand what's going through the mind of a buyer when they're looking at this home, and how are these things going to impact that buyer, especially if it's like a doink. Yeah, you don't get that.
Hurts.
Yeah, it hurts. It's not fun. And the thing is, it was completely unnecessary.
Right.
But it blew that deal up before it ever happened. Plus, Elizabeth probably would have never gone for it anyway. But, I was there.
So let's talk about a story that happened actually recently. Let's talk about, this is actually one of those situations that you don't always run into or may not think about. But it's a story about the new appliances that were boxed up in someone's garage, where they were going to, once they sold their house and move into the new ones, they were going to take those appliances and have those moved to the new home and installed.
Okay, well, so this is a fact scenario that Annie Fitzsimmons, who's the lawyer for Washington Realtors, just talked about, and I thought it was really interesting, especially since, I've been doing this for over 3 decades now, and I hadn't come across this one before. But so this is a situation. You remember that the language on the first page in item 5, it's all plural. We're talking about stoves, refrigerators, washers, dryers, dishwashers, etc. It's most of these are plural. Well, in this case, the seller had some brand new appliances still in the box, stored in the garage. I don't know what the seller was going to do with them, but probably take them over to the new house and get them installed later on. Well, with those things in the home, first of all, you've got this language that's plural. So if there's 2 or 3 fridges, you're selling 2 or 3 fridges. And you might say to yourself, well, yeah, but these are in boxes in the garage.
My intent was to move them.
Right, and the problem with it is that when you're talking about intent, you establish intent first by looking at the contract. And the contract is what establishes the intent between the parties. And unless there's an ambiguity in the contract, you stick with what the contract says. You only get to go to the other evidence of what intent is when there's something ambiguous in the contract. Then the courts will open it up and allow you to bring testimony in on what the parties really meant by what they were saying here. Well, in this case, you've got plurals.
Yep.
That means all of those items, and we had some of them, they were just in boxes, but it's part of the plural, right? And then when you go to item C in the contract, included items, the language is pretty clear. It says, any of the following items, including items identified in specific term number 5, if the corresponding box is checked, located in or on the property, are included in the sale. So in that case, that's not very ambiguous. It's not ambiguous.
Right.
And so given that you don't have any ambiguous language, I think there's a pretty strong argument that that seller sold those brand new fixtures or those brand new appliances in the garage. But what I've, in the years that I was doing litigation, one of the things that I said is, if you're going to win, you have to have a strong argument on the law, and it also has to be fair. And if you don't have both, and all you're doing is relying on the law, you've got a challenge because you've got to get past that fairness. And if you have an argument that sounds fair, but you don't have the law, then you're going to have a problem. And so to really go in to feel confident in winning something, particularly in litigation, you have to have both of those elements. And in here, you're missing one of those elements big time.
Right.
And that is, the seller, I think, did not intend to sell those brand new appliances that were still in the boxes. He's just using the garage as storage. Whereas on the other hand, the buyer might have been looking at that and saying, well, perfect, I'm buying these things too, and I can swap out the old stuff, or, who knows what they were thinking. But that's maybe what they're going to argue after the fact. So I still think, even though the contract is pretty clear, I still think you might have some tough sledding making that argument. And then the other thing that if I was arguing on behalf of the seller on this, I would say, okay, it says that any of these items located in or on the property are included in the sale. I would say, yeah, but that ends in a colon. That's not the end of the sentence.
Punctuation marks matter.
Punctuation marks matter. When you're dicing it this close, punctuation matters. And so in this case, now it goes on and it lists all of these other items, for example, the built-in appliances and wall-to-wall carpeting, those sorts of things. And the list goes on for a ways, and then it says after a semicolon, all of these have semicolons after them, and after one of the semicolons it says, and other fixtures. Which, when you're looking at that and you're looking at the sentence structure, that other fixtures implies that the things above it are fixtures. And now you get into, that isn't super clear, because now we're talking about other fixtures as if everything else is a fixture that's listed above it. That, to me, introduces some ambiguity into the paragraph here. And if that is, and I think a judge, if there is just that much ambiguity, the judge is going to allow additional evidence as to what the intent of the parties was. Because when you've got something that feels like it's fair going in another direction, usually a judge is going to try and get you to the fair part if it can be justified by the contract. And here, I think that's enough of an argument to maybe make it a little ambiguous, to introduce the intent of the seller. And so maybe there's a way to get these appliances back to the seller. But we still get back to the bottom line, and that is all of this that we're talking about, that's all litigation. And everybody's lost already when you're in litigation. Everybody loses in litigation. Even if you win, you lose. And so really, bottom line is, again, the same point that we made at the beginning. If the seller intends to exclude it, you need to put it in the contract. If the buyer intends to buy it, it needs to be put in the contract.
Right. So let's talk about another interesting piece in paragraph C that most people overlook. It's basically the clause that says the sale includes all associated operating remote controls and access permissions.
Well, that's kind of a new provision that's come in, I would say maybe within the last 10 years. And so many of our systems now are dependent upon access codes and remotes. Where it started was the garage door opener and the remote for the garage door opener. It started way back, because those have been around for a long time, and that was where this issue started, as sellers would leave with the garage door opener. And buyers would say, how do I get into my garage? And since then, with the expansion of all these smart devices, you need access codes and you need remotes to get them running. And so all of those things are considered, because they're written into the contract, they're considered fixtures. And anytime you have something that is essential to the use of an actual fixture, then the principle of it being a fixture applies to that, even though you could get up and walk away with it. Like, for example, if you had a big piece of machinery in a shop, and the purpose of the shop was to run that machinery, but it had a key to start it, and you left with the key, and you said, well, this obviously isn't a fixture, it's not attached to the real estate at all, and you left with it, well, that's considered associated with that fixture for the operation of it, and so it would be considered a part of it. And that same case law that established that also applies to remotes and codes to all of our equipment that's in the house.
Let's talk about another trap that's hidden in this clause, something that can catch people off guard: leased equipment.
Oh yeah, so the last line of this paragraph C says, unless otherwise agreed, if any of the above items are leased or encumbered, seller shall acquire clear title before closing. That can catch people off guard, and sellers sometimes don't understand that. So, for example, if you're leasing a propane tank, then the seller needs to pay off that propane tank for the buyer. as opposed to assigning the lease to the buyer and then the buyer just pick up with the payments on it. So if the seller does not want to buy that leased item for the buyer, and usually they don't, then there's another place in the contract where you can actually shift and assign that leased contract to the buyer at closing. And so that's something that we as brokers need to be aware of and guide our clients through those situations.
So if we were to distill this entire conversation into one lesson, what would it be?
If you want it, write it.
Simple as that. So the purchase and sale agreement is full of clauses that look routine, but hidden inside those clauses are real consequences. And today we unpack just one section, that's line 5 in paragraph C of the included items clause, which is a small part of the contract that can have very big implications if it's misunderstood. Dave, thank you again for walking us through this. Appreciate you so much. Always good to have a great conversation with you, and I will always learn from you so much.
Glad to be here, James.
Yes, buddy.
Thanks for inviting me.
So if you found this episode helpful, subscribe to the show so you don't miss future episodes where we break down the real-world situations hiding inside real estate contracts. And if you know someone buying, selling, or working in real estate, share this episode with them, because in real estate, the details aren't small, they are everything. Like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Peace, love, and light. Till the next one, see ya.
Let's go.
Let's go.